Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well today. My name's Jen Kingsmill. I'm an associate at Lewis Silkin, who is a UK-based firm, though we sort of help across the regions, and obviously here with East Aurora today. I'm going to be chairing the webinar with my colleagues from Brazil, Canada, and India. We're going to start off the webinar by talking a little bit about our own countries and sort of the background of what LGBTQIA plus is like in our countries in not a workplace environment, and then we're going to go into some sort of fireside chats with some questions that we've got, and then at the end we'll be doing a Q&A. So if anyone's got any questions, please do feel free to put those in the chat. As mentioned, I am an English and Welsh qualified lawyer. There's my lovely face on the screen. In the UK today, generally, it's a good place to be a gay person. Gay marriage was legalised in England and Wales in 2014, with the first marriage happening on the 29th of March 2014. Gender, transitioning and sexuality are all protected under the Equality Act 2010, which means that you can't directly discriminate or indirectly discriminate somebody for any of these things. Additionally, you shouldn't be harassing anybody or victimizing someone. This even extends to if there's an assumption that somebody is a particular gender or sexuality, even if they're not, or if somebody's associated with that. So there's quite a lot of protection in place. And it's also LGBTQ relationships are now taught in schools as well as part of our relationship education. So there's a lot more awareness across the country. Additionally, Pride, as I'm sure most people are celebrating at the moment, is big throughout the UK, with various Pride festivals happening across the UK throughout the month. However, that being said, there are still issues in England and Wales at the moment. A recent government LGBT survey found that 56% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, cis people are not out in the workplace. And that increases to 59% of trans women and 56% of trans men have avoided expressing their gender identity in the workplace, and 76% of non-binary persons as well. So it shows that there is still a lot of sort of harassment and negativity around sort of LGBT people, and people do not feel like they can be comfortable coming out. And so it's something that we need to sort of pride ourselves in and work as best practice to make sure that across the board, everyone can feel like they're bringing their best self to work and their authentic self and can be whoever they want to be while they can. And that's sort of the key issues that we'll be focusing on today. So with that all being said, Luiz, would you like to talk about it from a Brazil perspective and sort of introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jan. It's very nice being here. I am, well, as you can see, I am the only man in the panel, which is a challenge. And I am, of course, the more senior here. I'm a partner at the Verano firm that's has been a Use Bodies member for several years. I was one of the partners responsible for joining several years ago. It's a real pleasure talking about this subject, which is very dear to us. Give you a little bit of the environment in Brazil. What do we have? We have here is inconsistency. Inconsistency would define how our country deals with the LGBTQIA plus community, inclusion, diversity, and all that. Why that? We do not have laws in place that would, for example, protect gay marriage, but we do have court precedents from the Supreme Federal Court, and we have a ruling from the CNJ, which is the body overlooking all the judiciary system. So if you're gay, you're allowed to get married, and no registry can refuse that. So this is basically by court precedent. When you go to the Congress to discuss gay marriage, it's a big battle. That's when inconsistency kicks in. We do have laws that would allow transgender persons to transition and to be able to get new documents and names and all that. So those are basically state by state and municipal laws, but the process itself is bureaucratic and difficult. So this is one of the things we have to fight for, is to allow people to actually get access to all that. And I'll tell you a little bit of stories that we learned in the past time. So anti-discriminatory laws or initiatives are there, but still what we have in Brazil is a huge violence against the community. So the number of people who get assaulted and actually die is still astonishing. You may have learned that we lived from 1918 to 2022 a extreme right-wing government led by Bolsonaro, who is a very peculiar individual, and he basically made speeches and took positions that allowed people to basically get out of their holes and advocate all the violence against the LGBTQIA plus community. So those were very dark times in which society had to basically try to put together a network of protection of these people, but that was really difficult. And as you know, these things do not really go away immediately. So Bolsonaro was not reelected. He's the first president not to be reelected in history because he was really very questionable. He was declared last week ineligible for 8 years because of all the attacks he did to democracy. So nothing to do with the LGBTQIA plus community, but other problems. Part of the friction we have in Brazil has to do with religion. So Brazil is a very Catholic country, and also a growing number of Protestant churches, and they tend to adopt a anti LGBTQIA plus community position. They are against sex education at school. So the friction is enormous. So we live a inconsistency which basically reflects the division of our society. So just to give you the example, the election that elected Lula again back in October 2020 was basically 51-49. So Lula was elected 51%, Bolsonaro had 49% of the votes. That shows that you do have a very strong, a very significant community that is basically identified with extreme right positions. And when it comes to accepting and basically embracing LGBTQIA plus community, this is a disaster because they advocate the absolute opposite, and you'll always have the extreme people who go to violence. So still a very difficult place to be in Brazil if you are LGBTQIA plus member of the community. But we do have good initiatives. We have special ministry in the new Lula administration that has extremely good proposals. So people are feeling more comfortable to go to the streets to parade and all that. We had the Pride parades this month that were awesome. They were very good. And then getting to our specific point, workplace. Then I'll tell you a quick story. When Bolsonaro was elected, some lawyers formed a group of lawyers with the aim of protecting people of the LGBTQIA plus community, because we saw a development of this violence. So people were much more attacked. So we had a lot of work at the beginning, people attacked on the streets and all that. As time passed, we were called for to help people in lawsuits. And one of the cases we filed was a transgender man who was fired because he transitioned from she to he in his employment. And that was basically a very sad case, because we can say that things were done on purpose by the employer, but we can say that they didn't know how to handle that. If you don't know how to handle a very delicate situation, you just try to get rid of it, which was the wrong thing to do. So we represented this young man in his lawsuit. He won. He got all the indemnity he could, and he could even have been reinstated in that position, but he said no, because I want to basically walk away from that company, and he was already employed somewhere else. And he said it is easier to start as a man than to be in a place where I transitioned, which is true, right? So people knew him as a woman, and then after a few months or years, he was fully a man with new documents, new name, and all that. On workplace, what we see here, and I will sort of conclude with that so that we can pass on to the other panelists, is that there is a huge movement from structured companies, from companies that have contact with the multinational world that basically see what's happening everywhere. Brazil is a huge country, so we have, as we say, several Brazils within the country. So in the bubble we live, that's how I would say. That is the firm I work with, the companies that are well structured and serious, and big companies and multinationals. So we do have a lot of movement to accept people, to have diversity, to make sure that LGBTQA plus members can come out and identify themselves as members and be accepted in the workplace. I would say that this is still minority in the country. As I said, this is basically focused in the more developed areas of Brazil, in the south, southeast, the big cities that you have heard of, like Rio or São Paulo. This is true. If you go north, northeast, this is not true. So still, the poorer areas of the country, you do not have this awareness, and the movement is much less important. So there's a lot to be done. I think I'm going to stop here as introduction, Jean. We can go back to specific things that are happening. I think there's a lot to be said. Again, it's a pleasure being in this panel, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. I think you really raised a very good point there about in the cities, there being much more openness and inclusiveness. And then as you go more rural, there's sort of inclusivity often. I think this is definitely something that you see in England and Wales, but I'm sure this will be mirrored in other countries, that it just, the message sort of gets lost more, and the areas are sort of left, less left leaning in that sort of way. And I think that you definitely see where in more metropolitan areas, there's, like we say, more pride and things like that everyone can kind of be involved in. It does mean that people, even in very supportive communities, are more marginalised and more rural than they are. So I think that's a very good, interesting point that you raised there, Luiz. Debjani, would you be happy to introduce yourself and the position in India, please?
So there are a lot of parallels between what Luiz mentioned between Brazil and India. And so my name is Debjani Aich. I'm a partner with Cochrane Company. And just in terms of context setting, India has over 1.4 billion people. That's the context that we're looking at here. When we're talking about, forget, LGBTQI rights, we're looking at human rights here. Over 450 languages, dialects. India has one of the most socially complex communities that exist in the world. Having said that, let's talk about where we stand from a legal perspective. It is an evolving space with a lot of changes in the last decade or so. LGBTQIA++ rights have been evolving, but there's continuous social, legal, practical issues which non-community persons may not be able to identify with. Now, when we're talking about context, it was only in September 2018 that it became okay to be legally gay in India. It was a criminal offense till that time. In September 2018, that is when the Supreme Court of India unanimously ruled that the concerned criminal law provision, which dates back to 1860, said that section that said that homosexuality was a criminal offense was unconstitutional. It infringes on a citizen's fundamental rights to autonomy, to intimacy and identity. So we're talking about a very, very short time space wherein it is all right in India to be gay now. Interestingly, when we're talking about the LGBTQIA spectrum, now I want to spend a little bit of time also explaining how transgender rights work in India, mainly because historically, and this is across religions, again, India has a lot of religions, predominant, dominant religions, minority religions. But historically speaking, transgender individuals have been recognized as a third gender literally from time immemorial. And this is across religions. And that's not an easy thing in a diverse country like ours. But what happened is that colonialism and supersensitivity and framing of codified laws, there was a distinct narrowing down of the free thinking that India had seen earlier. And consequently, transgenders also became extremely marginalized, not only from a societal perspective, but also from an economic strata perspective. most of our laws were formed by, were codified by the British and were very binary in nature. Now, unlike, Jen talked about the fact about how law has evolved in the UK, but our laws, like I said, the Indian Penal Code dates back to the 1860, of course, with amendments. And a lot of our laws recognized only binary genders, male and female genders, but we've had some fantastic, really, really path-breaking judicial advocacy. It was in 2014, I think, there was a very, very prominent judgment called the NALSA judgment, wherein transgender individuals were formally recognized as the third gender. And we, in fact, have a specific law now that protects transgender individuals. It's a 2019 law called the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. Like any law, it's got its fair share of criticism, not only from trans individuals, but also cis folks, because it could have been better. It could have done more, but it's a step in the right direction. And I feel personally that that is something. We have something now. It's okay to come out of the closet and say that you're gay. I mean, that is a big thing. Pride marches exist across cities. But again, being the country that we are, being the diverse population that we are, some of it is accepted, some of it is not accepted. The government has been working on making changes. So India's employment laws are undergoing a massive change. About 44 federal laws are being amalgamated into 4 codes right now, and one of them deals with wages. And it's called the Code of Wages. And for the first time, as compared to the previous law, actually it's the existing law, it says that there's going to be parity in working conditions and pay for all genders. It's not restricting it to male and female employees, and which makes me cautiously optimistic about movement in the right direction. Having said that, harassment is rampant in the LGBTQI community. We have it's a very, very complex social structure, and these are marginalized folks. A lot of us are marginalized, and that can become an issue. The good thing is there is movement. I work in Bangalore, which is in the state of Karnataka, and various state governments in India, the Karnataka state government, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, they have adopted a lot of proactive measures to create awareness on human rights, equality, nomenclature. Those are really, really important steps to take in understanding and creating a platform for dialogue. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how judicial advocacy is working, not only from the lower court level, but also at the Supreme Court of India level. And this started back, I would say, between the early 2000s building up. For the first time, I recollect, and this was really, really interesting, in 2020, Uttarakhand, which is a very small state in India, actually said that same-sex cohabitation, so you could have a live-in relationship, a same-sex live-in relationship is protected by the law. And then we jumped to 2021, which was a Allahabad High Court, which is the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is one of India's largest states in terms of size and population. And from an employer-employee perspective, this was a really important judgment because the court said that it was wrong to remove an employee from the job because of his or her gender orientation. In that particular case, it was a home guard he was a gay man, and they said it was not okay. Sexual orientation is an extremely private person, is a private matter of an individual, and it's protected by privacy laws. So the correlation is happening right now. And I've spoken about this, I think, for one of the Us Laboris podcasts earlier. In April of last year, there was brilliant judicial pronouncement by the Madras High Court, which is in Tamil Nadu, which specifically directed the state government to conduct sensitization on LGBTQ issues. Of course, there was a variation in the terminology. In fact, that particular judge went on to undergo specific training to understand the concept. He came very clean, and he said, I'm too old to understand this, but I'm happy to educate myself about it. So he sat down and he spoke to members within the community, he spoke to non-governmental organizations, and he understood what was happening and then came up with a judgment. So it's an interesting evolving space. There is, and some of you may have read about the extremely complex case before the Supreme Court of India, which is currently pending on the issue of whether same-sex marriages can be legalized in India. There's massive pushback on it, especially from the government and from various quarters within the community. But this is something that the Supreme Court of India is currently considering, which leads to the premise that, you know, whether there are laws or not, at least judicial advocacy is there and people are speaking up. And that's really, really important in a country like ours.
It definitely sounds like a really interesting sort of developing place to be for an LGBTQI a person. And I think you make a really pertinent point at the very beginning about, you know, although it's more true than ever in India, but especially just in all the things that we're talking about, this is a human rights issue, not just something for LGBTQIA people. And I think that, you know, sort of delineating between sometimes talking about LGBT rights can sometimes seem like you're divisioning it off. But obviously, you know, the only way that we get things through and we help is by having allies as well, and across the board recognizing that people are people and we need across the board to have that support there. I thought that was a very strong thing to begin speaking about. And Deanah, would you mind sharing your perspective? I know there's, I keep referring to obviously LGBT plus QIAA, but I know that there's a different definition in Canada. Do you mind sharing some light on that?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. As Jen mentioned, my name is Deanah Shelly. I'm a partner at Matthews Dinsdale. It's a law firm in Toronto, Canada. I practice in the health and safety area, and I'm honored to be presenting here today with Jen and Debjani and Luiz. As Jen said, well, right off the top, actually, let me say, Debjani started by saying that India aligns somewhat more closely with Brazil. Well, let me jump on that and say I would echo that from the perspective of Canada is much more like the UK. If we're finding categories within the countries, we do have host Pride every year in June. It's a Pride Month. Many workplaces join into that celebration in various ways. Toronto itself in Canada has hosted World Pride as well. Now, let me say, so that is a positive. It's very well attended. And we are at the point where we are now as a country is we are increasing security, right? As rights erode, as increased challenges appear to the community. And I'll give you our acronym in a moment. But as issues arise, especially to our neighbor in the US, we're feeling some impact here in Canada. So things like increased security is something that we're seeing more regularly in this country. But let me go back to what Jen said, which is the acronym. And we've been using LGBTIQ pretty consistently. And I think there is an internationally recognized acronym for this community. In Canada, the government of Canada fairly recently adopted 2S LGBTIQ+. The 2S has been within the acronym for the community for some time, but it's been moved to the front of the line, if I could say, and that represents two-spirit. And that refers to a person whose identity is masculine and feminine. So they identify as having a masculine and feminine spirit. And that's used by our Indigenous community. And you've probably been, if you have heard on the news, we're recognizing as a country our many failings. I'm not saying we've recognized them all, but we're understanding the impact a little bit more that we've had over generations of harm to our Indigenous peoples. And I think that's part of the effort to make sure that we're identifying and we're representing that 2S, that two-spirit community. And the Indigenous people, I would say it's probably more similar to what Debjani was saying, is this almost like this third gender. The Indigenous peoples and community have always had the two-spirit, and that is something that reflects on a sexual identity, a gender identity, and a spiritual identity. So it's not one thing. It's all encompassing, even though the language is two-spirit. You know, in terms of, you know, I don't want to go into too much detail because I know we have questions to get through. And so I won't go through necessarily what I had planned on, but I will mention that, you know, we've got a fairly robust, depending on who you are, human rights code and human rights legislation that's in every province, in every territory, and that it has protected grounds, and certainly sexual orientation and sexual identity are part of those protected grounds as well. Marriage, same-sex marriages has been legal now for some time, and that was and we're working through that constantly. I would say, you know, perhaps we're in a good place compared to many countries, but we're also at the point of we can see some of these rights eroding, and we're also given the opportunity to look at the statistics, and we see it's the 2S LGBTIQ plus children, youth, who are the most homeless. It's the 2S LGBTIQ plus community members who have the lowest wages, the greatest number of job turnover. So really consistent marginalization for people in this community, and I think that's what we're hoping to do here is talk about that a little bit more to also to move the dial forward, to help be better inclusive in the workplace, and then protect also against any erosion of rights that we've achieved and hopefully spreads globally. I'll end there, Jen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Deanah. I personally find the two spirits very interesting. It's not something in the UK that we have much sort of information about because there isn't as much of an Indigenous community here. And I also sort of really echo what you're saying in terms of, you know, you look at the vulnerable communities that are sort of out there, and LGBTQIA people are very much present within that, especially if you look at intersectional communities as well. So there being sort of people who are disabled in LGBTQIA, or being an ethnic minority and being LGBTQIA, that kind of intersectionality of things really sort of you can see in those communities, they're very much affected and very vulnerable, which is one of the reasons why, you know, even with legalization and positivity moving forward, there's always still a fight to be fought, not just in sort of countries where rights are still sort of forming, but still in our countries as well, where things are supposedly a lot more further on. And I think that's one of the reasons why having this talk is so important, because it is still a very personal issue that we all still do need to be talking about and addressing. Thank you guys all so much for sort of doing our sort of introduction. I thought it was very interesting from my perspective, and we'll sort of go through these questions that we've had and sort of add a bit more light onto everything more specifically. The first question that we've had is more sort of a general one of how can companies create an inclusive LGBTQIA plus workplace for employees? I'm also just going to say that from an ease perspective, I'm going to start saying LGBTQ plus, but when I say that, I mean LGBTQIA plus, but it's just a little bit wordy, so just for the purpose of this talk. But I hope everyone realizes that I am trying to be as inclusive. But from a UK perspective, I think that it's about making sure that we are best practice, best for our employees, and also best for our clients. You know, clients also want to be working with inclusive workspaces and things like that, something that you see a lot in the UK. And I think internationally is big brands changing their logos during Pride Month and things like that to be very supportive of the LGBT and LGBT awareness. But I think the sort of really pertinent point is making sure it's not just tokenism. Pink washing that is talked about quite a lot is this idea that companies will put on the pink branding and say, yes, we love gay people, LGBT people are the best, but then not actually sort of have any proof in the pudding, so to speak. And a way that I think in the UK that we're quite good at sort of making sure that we're putting LGBTQ issues at the forefront in our workplaces is by making sure that you've got an open sort of culture about it. This means having it on the website. This means internally talking about it. You need buy-in from senior managers across the board. It can't just be at the sort of lower levels where people are sort of supportive of this, but then you're not seeing it reflected throughout the business. And I think that even if you're not aware of, because obviously it's up to people to come out, that there aren't senior managers who are part of the community, allies are still essential part of all of this. I also think things like networks are a very key part of the UK culture here. So making sure that internally there's an LGBTQIA network, and as well as other networks for other sort of protected characteristics and things like that. At the moment we see quite a lot of gender networks as well. We also have networks for sort of race and belief and things like that. And it means that internally, if there is anything that comes up that you think may affect a certain community, you can speak to the network and get their perspective on it. But also these networks can help sort of bring people together, have a community within a workplace and feel much more included. And I think that also if there's ever something that there might be a clash between networks, a good way is to be able to speak to those representations and make sure that there is a sort of open dialogue and communication between that. Another thing that people often say is sort of the gay job and the day job. And this idea that if you are an LGBTQ person, you end up doing LGBTQ work, when actually you want to be doing all different kinds of work. And there's this idea that LGBTQIA work isn't of the same standard or isn't valued as much, but making sure that within your company, there is a value placed on it, and any work that somebody does volunteering as part of that internal network, for example, is talked about during performance reviews and things like that, and it has an equal value put in that place. You know, this internal work that's being done is just as valuable as, you know, for me being a lawyer, bringing in money as well. There's a part of the internal values is essential. And so I think it's making sure you respect that. Naturally as well, calling out LGBTQ harassment across the board. I think initiatives such as Speak Out are very important. Having a zero tolerance approach to any harassment or abuse across the board. And if there are sort of international events that happen, such as, you know, we've obviously seen a lot of abuse towards the trans community recently, I think it's important for companies to email their employees across the board and say, are people okay? Can we help out? Things like having private medical that supports transitioning, that has counselling that is available with LGBTQ specialists. Things like that people might not think about that actually really do help support the LGBT community within the workplace. I know I've been talking for a while, but I'm just going to add a couple more points before I sort of open the floor up, is that if you are an international workforce, so you have offices, for example, England, Brazil, Canada, India, all of these places, how do you make sure that you're not just inclusive in one country, but inclusive across the board? And also, for example, if you have an office in a country where it's illegal to be part of the LGBT plus community, how do you sort of rectify that? And I think the main thing is sort of being alive to those issues, making sure that if you do need somebody to travel from one country to another, are they comfortable with that? Having a conversation with them, is it a place where they legally can go and be safe? Opening that dialogue and having a very open nature with that, and having a designated HR person for people to discuss it with. But also, I think it's important that we speak to the people in those countries. How do they want the issues to be dealt with? How can we be able to be inclusive to them? It's not about telling people what it means to be inclusive. It's about listening and having that dialogue back and forth. So I'm going to open up the field a bit more now. So Debjani, from an India perspective, what would you sort of say is a key thing to be bearing in mind for workplaces?
So I'm going to spend, I'm going to preface this by saying that the sensibilities and sensitivities in a country like India are something that many folks in other locations may not appreciate. And also from a workspace, it continues to be gender skewed. Forget talking about diversity here. So things that I believe and that I've recommended and I've seen that work is that it, and as Jen, as you've said, it can't be tokenism. Sure, we've got a law that talks about the prevention of sexual harassment of women at work. But if your managers are not sensitized to that issue, then having the law doesn't make sense. And here we don't even have we have one codified law. Everything else is judicial precedent. So that is something that organizations in India need to work, I feel, a little bit better on. Some of them are doing some stellar work, but there's a lot of space. It cannot be tokenism. You cannot have mid-management, senior management folks saying it's okay or cracking jokes that are inappropriate. You know, the little school, the little cliques that go around where it's going to be okay, it's not okay. So it cannot be tokenism. Another thing that I found that works really effectively is having not just a general HR functionary role, but a nodal officer who is going to, of course, they can handle general HR because those are employment rights, those are employee rights. But if LGBT folks know that there is this one person in the organization who I can go to in a safe space, that would be really helpful. So having a nodal officer would be great. In terms of employment policies, our laws are protectionist, mostly towards women so far. Make them, now, the first thing that comes to mind is our prevention of sexual harassment laws. Great thing is there, at least again by way of judicial pronouncement, the protection is afforded to a woman, but by way of judicial pronouncement, it includes transgender women as well, which is brilliant. But we need to have gender neutral policies. From a maternity law perspective, think about it a little bit more. If we're saying that same gender cohabitation is okay, maybe you want to relook at your maternity leave policy. Maybe you want to look at your paternity leave policy, your surrogacy laws, things like that. And you know, we love celebrations, we love parties. Pride Month is great, but let's go beyond that. Let's just have the lanyards a little bit longer, maybe have a little bit more awareness, have the posters around all of the time. It's really interesting because at the firm, I was the one who kind of started the inclusion and diversity, or, you know, jumped onto it. And then I had my little flag at the background. And
I was going to point that out earlier. I was saying, thank you for representation.
yeah, I used to, you know, so I've been a long-standing ally, and I love having the flag at work, and it makes me happy. And when folks walk into my office, they know that if nothing else, there is a space here where a visual reminder is important. You know, it helps. You know that there is this person. So that visual thing, creating ally links and resources. That's something again that I think that will be really, really important for companies in India to look at a more inclusive space.
I couldn't agree more. You know, it has to be also an acknowledgement that it's an ever-changing space, you know, as we see across the countries, across the board, not just in one country, but in all countries. It's something that's developing. You know, Deanah talking about the two spirits being added. You know, we have to make sure that it's very clear that even if there is guidance for allies, this is still something that will constantly be changing and developing as society does. And I think what you mentioned about gender neutral policies is very relevant. You know, not only, I think people have most of their policies are gender neutral, but then they don't think about the maternity policies, the paternity policies. Those are written with, you know, when a woman, but no, there are gender neutral people, there are trans men, there are lots of people who may get pregnant and have children that are not going to fit within the sort of gender confines of that. And so I think that, again, looking at those sort of issues that aren't sort of at the forefront and thinking, how can we be inclusive across the board? And that in itself shows that it's not tokenism. When you're not just doing the obvious thing of, like you say, wearing a lanyard for a month and then taking it off, when across the board you're showing in every area, this is an inclusive space. Deanah, from a sort of Canada perspective,
I'd like to jump in on that because I think it flows nicely from the last few comments by Debjani. And so I tried to think about, we of course had practice sessions. You know, we met the group of us, and we kind of thought through what each of us generally would say, and I knew there would be some meaningful commentary provided on, you know, considering policies, reviewing policies, and looking at that. And I'm certainly going to talk about that later on in a little bit more detail, time permitting. But for this one, for this particular question, which is how to create a more inclusive environment, I went to an aesthetic. I went to, you know, and that's, you know, what was commented on. I just have this flag right here, right? I think that what I want to talk about is something that I think is practical. I see as fairly easy depending on how you go about doing it. And I think it has high impact. And what I want to talk about here and ask for you to consider is, well, right now, I mean, think about your workspace. Think about the office that you're in, and think about the workplace as you walk into it. Think about reception, how you welcome people, whether it be you or your colleagues or people external to the office coming in. What tone are you setting by way of the aesthetics on the wall, the photographs on the walls, the posters, not really likely to be posters unless they're inspirational messages, but the paintings, those sorts of things. Do you have a lot of sports paraphernalia? Is that expressive of all, right? Can we amend that? Can we make it better? So I'm asking people to, if you're wanting to make a space more inclusive, to think about what you have on your walls, what the aesthetic is, what is the message that you're sending when somebody walks in. Because you know what, maybe people who see the pride flag, I can't imagine, but maybe there are still some people that just don't know what it is, right? And two, there are different pride flags. And again, time permitting, I'll talk about the progress flag too. And people who are looking for cues, people who are looking to see if they fit in, if there's been consideration given to them and how they walk through life, they are looking for these things. And if they see happens to be a gay icon. Maybe not a lot of people know, but certainly if you're in that world, you know that that's a gay icon. If, you know, those are the things, if it's a player on a sports team, and that person is either very pride mindful, an advocate in the community, even if they don't identify as gay, if you've got their jersey up, and wow, that means a lot to people who are looking for those cues, and sometimes desperately looking for those cues to see that, wow, this is a workplace that is actually, maybe they didn't mean to, but it seems like, wow, they probably did. Maybe I can feel a little bit more comfortable. I can ask a few more questions, but it shows that you've been considered. And so I say to you right now, I ask you to look around your office. If you're not in a Luiz situation where you are hoteling, so you jump into a room that is barren. But if you have an office that is your own, you put up a flag. If you have say in what the aesthetic is in the workplace itself, then you make comments and you try and change what is currently there to make it more inclusive. And I certainly don't think it needs to be in your face at all. Right? It doesn't need to say a sign that says we are inclusive here. I don't think that's the right way forward. I think it's to be nuanced about it. It's to be gentle about it, but it's to convey a message. And certainly in one of our boardrooms at my law firm, we have a picture of B. Matthews, and it's Matthews, Dinsdale, and Clark. So we have a picture of B. Matthews, one of the founding lawyers of the firm. And especially when the people who identify as women go into that boardroom, it's not unusual for us to say, you know, oh, there's B, and just to talk about her and how she was a founding member of a firm that's been around for a long time. I think 1959, but I'm sorry if that's the wrong date, but we've been around for a while, and we still had a woman as a founding member, and we're recognizing it. That means a lot to us. And that certainly isn't to us LGBTIQ matters, but that is something that it is demonstrating, you know, some level of diversity, right? So it's continuing upon that. It's making that better and making that stronger. And again, think about it right now, what you have that you think you can make better, meaning more inclusive, more diverse, that would still, that I think is practical, but has high impact for those people who are looking for cues. Yeah.
I think that's very perfectly summarized, and also shown in Debjani's very subtle but obviously clear flag. I think it's little things like that you said that make a big difference. And we've had actually a question come in from someone called Ivan about how do you give cues when you're in a home office setting. Was actually what I was thinking was this is even more pertinent with the increase of home working, that when you have your own home office, you can really personalize it in similar ways that Debjani has. I'm conscious to move on to Luiz, but I just wanted to know if anyone, considering we've had a question about personalising a home office setting, if anyone wanted to add anything else in before we move quickly over, though Luiz, I'm sure you might have comments on that as well. Luiz, you're on mute. Has to happen once.
The most popular sentence in the last 2 years, you're on mute. I want to start with something. I mean, I was basically taking notes here because I think that this is sort of a lesson of what you can do in so many things. And I think, I mean, goes from what you have in your walls, the way you structure your firm, your workplace. I think it has a lot to do with what you can do in your home office place. I think that really, the way I see it today, especially when I do have 2 days in home office and 3 days here, and here I have this totally unpersonal space, which we love, right? We really like that because everybody the same and a lot of open office. When I go home, I need to have all the memorabilia of my life, you know, and I'm getting old, so it's got lots of things. So it's a very busy place with books and paintings and maps and things. So I think you have to basically put together that place that is the place you feel absolutely comfortable. And it is very good if you can have the images and the messages pass through that. So I love what you did, Debjani, with your background. So it's about that, right? But I wanted to cover something that I think is very important, and that for me is really my focus here, which is how do you engage leadership? Because I think that all that needs to go through leadership. So I was invited to be the lead of the LGBTQI plus a group in the firm because I'm a partner, because I'm male, because I'm old. So I represent senior partner in the firm, right? So I'm sort of old. Don't laugh. 57. I'm getting there. So And because people know that I have two lesbian daughters who are extremely happy, one of them married to another woman and living her life and very active. And, so they know that this is not going to be an issue for me because I don't, I mean, I show that everywhere in the websites and all places.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm very proud of them, very proud of them. And one of them is very activist. I talked to her a lot before coming here because I said, I need to learn. So she's my consultant for this work. And what I think that really makes a huge difference is when you get leadership actually involved. And just to share our experience, how did we do that in a way that I think the message to people is good? We have been inviting transgender people. Last month we invited a group which is mothers of transgender kids. They're a very active group. So these people come to speak to our firm, and they speak to all offices we have, to the 4 offices, but they actually do that physically in one place. And what we try to do is to have leadership there, right? So not only listening, but asking and endorsing. Because what I think is that the message can be good, but people sometimes believe, well, this is an initiative that is restricted to HR, that is restricted to a group of young lawyers who are gay, but they do not represent the firm or the company or the policy. So you need to have leadership for people to say, well, these guys actually care, or at least they're trying to care. And they're telling us publicly that they agree with what this transgender guy who is an activist said. So we bring these people here basically to tell about their lives and their fights and what they have accomplished. And it's very inspiring, very inspiring. Those events have been more and more popular. At the beginning, a smaller group, and we have a long way to go. Of course, you're talking about, as I said, a country that is divided. The leadership is about my age, so early 50s to mid 60s. So that's basically what leadership looks like. So you need really to engage these people so that the younger people coming in, they not only, everything we said here is relevant, but they also feel that we mean it. And when a problem that is serious comes up, that leadership will not just walk away, because putting the flag at the front at the building would be enough, but you don't really have the policy and the awareness and the will to actually act. So this thing about being totally intolerant with discrimination, I think it is easier than being able to actively think and build and apply policies that would be protective. Even policies like, I will have a recruitment process that will be only for LGBTQI plus community members. We did that for Black community. We did. So this is something that has happened in Brazil. As I mentioned to you in our preparation, we have a population of Black people that is over 50%. And that does not reflect in the population of firms and law firms and companies in general. So we launched a recruitment that would say only for Black people. There was a lot of surprise and say, well, we are basically trying to level the playing field. Why can't we do the same for the LGBTQI plus community? That would be interesting, not only to say we recognize you exist, to say to people who are already here but have never come public, to say you can declare what you are. We don't mean, and we are actually doing that. So that's something we have not done yet, but it's basically being discussed. And I think this only happens if leadership is there. That is my point. I think leadership should be a focus, and leadership is usually more difficult, right? Because we are older. And if you look back when we started working in the 80s, that's my case, in the mid 80s, beginning of the 90s, that was a non-issue, right? We were making the wrong jokes. We were basically telling the wrong stories and acting wrong. And that was basically fine. It's like smoking inside an airplane. If you're too young, you can't even imagine that. So, I was there when people were smoking inside an airplane. It was natural. When we think about that today, you say, well, we were crazy. So I think that converting leadership is a must to be able to implement everything else. And leadership is, typically, right, you have the younger generation, but typically you're talking about people for whom this does not come naturally. Right. I think I had the privilege of being educated by my daughters, but that's not true everywhere. right? So if you have a very traditional lifestyle and family and church and all that will sound very strange to you if you're in your mid-50s. I think that's a challenge. And I think we should, put on the top of the list, if you want to have an inclusive environment in your company, that you need to have engagement of leadership.
I couldn't agree
I think
more.
that's pretty much it.
And I must admit, I look forward to the day where discrimination against LGBTQIA people is as shocking as the idea of smoking on an airplane. So I'm conscious of time, and we've got a few questions left, which I know that people really were keen to speak on. So I'm going to suggest that we do sort of a quick fire round of sort of hot points on each of these questions. Though naturally, if there's more that we have to say, we discussed this in our prep, that we knew this could end up being a series of sort of webinars because there's so much to say. And I will say that I think everything that everyone said has been so fascinating and really valuable. So I think it's been a good use of time. But now, quick fire. What training can companies provide to support LGBTQIA people? In the UK, we generally don't have training which is just on LGBTQI things. Networks might do sort of events throughout the year, but generally it's more about diversity, inclusion training generally, and making sure there's an equality and awareness of speaking out against all forms and making sure everybody feels inclusive. Okay, Luiz, could you give some top points on training?
I'm totally with you. We do not do specific LGBTQI plus community training, but we do a lot of inclusion and diversity training, putting everyone together, and then making sure that everyone is buying in. And we usually do that by inviting these people from the communities to tell their story. So activists who come here, and we usually invite them and pay them and have breakfast with them, and that has been pretty effective.
I totally agree. And I think making it compulsory as well makes a very big difference too. Deanah, what about you with training?
So we, in every province and in every territory, we have human rights legislation, which speaks to these things, which I'd mentioned earlier. We also have health and safety legislation in every territory and every province. And I will echo Luiz and Jen and say there is not some specific training on 2S LGBTIQ plus matters or issues, but it is definitely embedded. And I can say for with regards to health and safety training, that you have an obligation as an employer to provide health and safety training, and that includes workplace violence, workplace harassment, and workplace sexual harassment. And that includes discrimination. So that would be included in that. And I don't know that every company does it as in a fulsome manner as they ought to, but it is there. It is required by law. But again, not explicitly, but absolutely within the occupational health and safety realm, it is mandated and imposed on employers to do.
Your specialism, I believe, Deanah. So
what's that?
You're a health and safety lawyer, are you?
Yeah.
So your specialism.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Debjani, training from an Indian perspective.
Okay, nothing that requires it. Everybody does inclusion and diversity, but here I have a couple of thoughts, mainly because I work all the time in this space, is often it is the manager. It's the mid-level manager who's the first point of, and I'm speaking from an India context, who's the one who's looking at team dynamics, who's the one who's doing the first point of contact if there's an issue, who's the one kind of looking at the team. So this is something that I think that companies can explore. In addition to your general D&I training, maybe you want to look at a little bit more of sensitization, a little bit of deep thinking, specifically for that segment of your employees. Because I feel that once that segment is more aware and attuned to what's required, even just once a year, there is merit in making sure that things are more smoother. I mean, I know for a fact that very few people are going to be speaking about transitioning. It's something that is not open. It's something that people are unaware of. So that is another aspect that I would like the trainings to focus on. It's great to have gender-based training. It's great to have ethnicity, race, religion, all of that. But these aspects need to come into the trainings as well.
I agree. And I think specifically having a transitioning policy is something that all companies should be looking into these days. It's a very pertinent issue, and it will mean that when you were talking about sort of allies training earlier as well, having a transitioning policy specifically means that people know when they're entering an organization and what sort of steps they need to take, and allies can know how they can support people in those environments as well, because it's ever changing. People don't always know. So I think that that's very important. In
And
terms
without,
of-
and Jen,
oh, yes,
Jen,
please.
without that dialogue, without, without almost forcing that point, then the conversation doesn't happen, and little changes even cannot be afoot, right? But just even starting that dialogue, even without the policy, but starting the dialogue will make people more aware to be more inclusive.
I totally agree. And then on our I'm aware that this is our last question, and I am also conscious that this isn't a question that really should be spoken about briefly, considering sort of the pertinent issues that it's going to raise. But it's specifically, how can we make workplaces more inclusive for trans people? Obviously, it's a community which has faced a lot of oppression and aggression recently. And I want to make it clear that we intended to spend much more time on this question, but it's just the way that the conversation has gone that we've ended up it being sort of the last question. But I did think it was important that we raise it. I personally would also just like to mention that I am a cis woman and therefore can't speak on it from the perspective of somebody who is trans, and I think that in itself is an issue and it would be useful. But I just sort of wanted to raise that. From a sort of UK perspective, I would say key things are sort of listening to the trans people within your sort of offices. And if you don't have somebody who has come forward as being trans or who's comfortable speaking on that behalf, then obviously getting in outside sort of assistance, I think, is really important. It is something like we discussed, having trans inclusion policies, non-gendered policies, and speaking out against anti-trans beliefs. Something that I also mentioned earlier is making sure that employee assistant helplines and counselling has sort of special focus within the trans, being able to give advice in relation to trans specific issues. Additionally, something that we were talking about earlier in terms of homelessness in the LGBT community, trans people especially are really sort of having issues with that. And so it's having an awareness in offices what might be going on in people's personal lives, and especially with the oppression that's being faced, making sure that there is sort of a looking out of all of the people in your community and checking in on people. I think that generally mental health is something that's talked about a lot in the UK at the moment, but that's even more pertinent for our trans employees. And overall, it's just making sure that we put that open dialogue, and like you say, Luiz, having senior buy-in coming from the top down as to how we're sort of going to create this inclusive atmosphere. Again, I appreciate that we don't have much time, but Deanah, could you sort of talk about the sort of trans side and 2SF?
Yeah, I will. And I'll just do it very briefly, and I'll do it by way of tying back to the first one, which is visual cues. And in North America, we have across the globe, we have the pride flag, right? But we have a progress pride flag that was introduced in 2018 in North America, and it specifically now it changes that pride flag, and it includes now chevrons of the pride that the flag that existed for the trans community. So it's basically an amalgam of the two, the pride flag and the trans flag, and other things too. I won't get into those, but that is specifically, again, I mentioned, if you're looking for cues and if you want to find notations, communication that there is a place that has considered you, even things like that, if Debjani's flag also had those chevrons, somebody who is aware of the progress flag in North America, I don't know how far it's transcended yet, but that would be a way to just mark inclusion kind of very easily again and right off the top.
Right. And Luiz, sorry,
I'll say one thing, Jan. I think that special people need special care. We do have a program, for example, for very poor people who join the firm, and they have special people, someone who is assigned to follow them up because they have needs that other people would not have. So we make sure that it's not only recruiting the person who comes from a lower social place, but basically giving this person means to do it. So special English course, because they were not, they didn't have English classes. I think the same should be done for transgender employees. We had a program to hire only transgender lawyers. We were able to hire one, and it didn't work, and it was our fault because we hired the person, and then we basically threw her. It was a trans woman into the workplace, and 6 months later she said, not possible. So this person should have special monitoring and one person responsible for being the point of contact and to talking to her or him on a constant basis to make sure the needs are being at least understood. So we are learning as we go, but it's a difficult, and when you go talk about trans people, those are the ones that need more assistance, no question about it.
Definitely. Reverse mentoring, I think, is very key in situations like that. Debjani, are you happy to provide sort of our final comments before we hand back to Yoshua?
So we have specific law, but our companies, the funny thing is a lot of people don't know we have specific law. We need companies to know that hiring, firing, recruitment, everything for trans people is the same as anybody else. The requirement of that nodal officer is key. Gender neutral bathrooms, please, gender neutral bathrooms are really, really important. Let people use the bathroom they need to go to. And of course, when we're coming, so you have great EAP programs, you have your counselors, you have all of that. But are they aware about the fact that they could have a trans employee? We need to go a little bit of extra here from an India perspective, wherein it is going to take some time, it's going to take some space, but those are aspects that need to be built in across board for all organizations.
Thank you so much. I personally feel like I've learned a lot and also just very much enjoyed having this conversation with you all, and would be very interested in the rest of the series. But I'll hand back to Yoshua now, and thank you guys all so much. Genuinely very fascinating.
Thank you.